How you doing, ladies and gentlemen? This is Kieno Thomas again with STEMwithKieno.com, and this is the third segment of Aviation Pre-Flight, Indoctrination Prep, and Undergraduate Pilot Training Prep. The last video, which you can find on YouTube if you go to STEMwithKieno.com, that's STEMWITHKIENO.com. STEMwithKieno.com. When you go to the landing page, I have a YouTube icon on the landing page, and you can click on that, and you can find videos 1 and videos 2 on aerodynamics. So basically, this is the third video on aerodynamics, and in the last video, what we touched on was the angle of attack, relative wind, and the definitions or terms and definitions associated with an airfoil. Basically, I am finishing off that part at this point, and I want to talk about a couple things. I'm looking at my notes here. The two things we need to talk about is Spanwise and Chordwise airflow. So we have the fuselage, and we talked about the 5 major components of an aircraft. So this is the fuselage, and excuse my little artwork here. This is the horizontal stabilizer, the vertical stabilizer is here, and you're going to have the 2 wings, or the total wingspan, stretch out there. Okay, so as the aircraft flies through the air, let me get a different color. Alright, so as the aircraft flies through the air, the air molecules are going to pass over the airplane like this. All right. But we talked about vectors, and basically we're going to have a vertical component over the wings, and just think about a boat as it cuts through the water, and we're going to have a horizontal component. Okay, so we're going to have what we call spanwise and chordwise flow. So airflow is going to be flowing chordwise over the wings, and it's also going to be as the aircraft cuts through the air, it's going to be breaking through the air molecules, and you're going to have a spanwise. So we're going to have a chordwise, and we're going to have a spanwise airflow. So we're going to have 2 components. And basically what you need to know is the spanwise and wingspan. Think about wingspan. Alright, so we're going to have the component of air flowing in that direction. And the spanwise airflow is the airflow that travels along the span of the wing, parallel to the leading edge. So this is the leading edge of the airfoil on both sides, and this is the trailing edge of the wing as we look at it as it flies through the air. So the spanwise flow is pretty much parallel to the leading edge. Alright, so it flows that way. And it is not responsible for lift because no air is accelerated over the wing. If we go back to, if we look at a side view of the wing here, alright, and the lift is developed because as we fly through the relative wind, what happens is the air molecules have to move faster over the top than the bottom, and we get negative pressure. So back to what we spoke about when we talked about Bernoulli's principle. Bernoulli's principle states that as the velocity of a fluid increases, its internal pressure decreases. So we get negative pressure on the bottom of the wing. Let's get our blue marker. We get negative pressure, and we get positive pressure on the bottom. Newton's third law of motion: for every force there's an equal opposite force. So the spanwise airflow is not responsible for lift. It's just a force that's going to be produced as the aircraft flies through the air. But the chordwise airflow is, and if we look at this from a side view, this is the chordwise airflow. Alright, so the air molecules need to move faster because we have more curvature on the upper camber. And I know I'm using some terms. If this is your first time looking at our video, here, if you go to YouTube, or if you go to STEMwithKieno.com, you will understand what I mean by the airfoil terms that I'm using. So at this point, I am going into the next section here. All right. Give me a moment. So yeah, just as a reminder, let me remind you, if you have not passed, this video is for people that have received a flight contract. You know you're going to flight training, and you're waiting on a date for flight training to begin your flight training. This is who the video is for. It is not if you are preparing for the AFOQT, the SIFT, and the AFOQT is for the United States Air Force. The SIFT is for the United States Army, and the AFOQT is for the United States Navy, the United States Marine Corps, and the United States Coast Guard. All right, so you can look at this video, I guess, for motivational purposes, but you need to be focusing on your test. All right, so I am going to jump into the next subject, and I'm just pulling out my talking points. Just give me a moment. There's definitions that we need to cover. We're going to talk about, at this point, we're going to talk about primary forces that act on an airplane. All right. So we'll erase that. Okay. Unfortunately, you're going to have to deal with my artwork. Alright, so here's our airplane flying through the sky. Here's our wing. Alright, so there's four primary forces that act on the aircraft. The first one we're going to talk about is lift. The forward is thrust. The downward vector is weight. And the rearward vector is drag. Okay, so these are the four fundamental forces that act on an aircraft. We have lift, we have thrust, we have weight, we have drag. Now, drag has two subcomponents. Drag can be broken down into induced drag and also parasite drag. Now, for my subscribers that are going through the course, drag has two subcomponents, induced and parasite. Now, the induced drag is caused by basically the generation of lift. Just because we're generating lift, we're going to have some drag happen. It's a byproduct of lift. So just the fact that we are producing lift, we're going to have induced drag. And the second one is parasite drag. Parasite drag is caused by basically having things protrude into the relative wind. And again, I'm using terms that you need to look at video 1 and video 2, which can be found on YouTube. And please like and subscribe. All right. So we talked about angle of attack in the video. When we first take off and we're just looking at the wing from a side view, all right, the aerodynamic force that's going to be produced is basically a vertical upward moment. This is how the plane takes off when it's on the ground and it's pretty much level at the point where it starts to generate lift. You push forward on the throttle, or it will be this way. You push forward on the throttle, and basically airflow will start to be generating over the wing, and the wing produces lift that way. Okay, so basically as we start producing lift, the aerodynamic force is going to be upward. All right, but when we start to take off, we're going to pitch our nose up. Another term that is in video 1 and video 2. You need to check that out on YouTube. So as we start to pitch the nose up, the airfoil, the plane is like kind of pointed this way, and then the nose comes up, and so the wing tilts up. So the relative wind is coming in like this. The chord line is pointed upward like this, and that's a little off, but basically this is the what we call angle of attack. All right, so that's our angle of attack measured in degrees. And basically, we do have a lift component upward, but we also have a drag component. So the resultant aerodynamic force will actually be here, and it is a component of the lift and the drag forces. So the lift is actually going to be produced in that direction as we fly or as we climb through the air. All right. All right. Now, the next point that I'm going to go to, as military pilots, you are going to be probably 9 times out of 10, some of you will be flying aerodynamic aircraft. So it's very, very important that you understand how lift is being produced. You're going to be at certain pitch angles. All right. So let's say we did a loop. Our plane comes in and it does a loop. Well, the loop is continuously changing. If you ever watch like the Blue Angels and stuff, as we go into the maneuver, the airfoil is going to be positioned like this, and the lift is going to be in that direction. I'll just put L, and the relative wind is going to be coming in this direction, R, W. I'll just put R. So as we go into the top of the loop, now the airfoil is going to look something like this, and the relative wind is going to be coming in this way, and the lift is actually going to be produced this way. As we get into the top of the loop, the airplane will be upside down, and it will look like this. Relative wind, lift will be produced in this direction, and then as we come down into this part of the loop, and we're in a dive basically, the airfoil will look like this. Relative wind will be coming at the wing or approaching the wing that way, and lift will be produced in that direction. So in this loop maneuver, basically the angle of attack will be changing, the relative wind will be changing, and you need to be cognizant of that situation and the vectors. Okay, let's talk about lift and factors that affect lift. Lift is basically, the lift produced by a wing is a function of speed. So when we have our wing, all right, here's our wing from a side view. All right. As the relative wind approaches, it needs to be approaching, the air molecules need to be approaching the wing at a certain speed. Let's say the air passes over the wing, and this is synonymous with, like, I don't know if you remember when you were a kid, you used to stick your hand out of the window and you would feel the airflow. You can't see the airflow, but you could feel it. Basically, with wings on airplanes, we need to be producing a certain amount of thrust to produce a certain amount of speed. So let's say in order to sustain the weight of the aircraft, we need at least 60 miles per hour, because that's what you guys are. If I said knots per hour, you'd be like, what? But you need a certain amount of speed in order to keep the aircraft in the air. And this is produced by the engines, or what we call power plants, because power plants do more than drive the aircraft. They push the aircraft forward, and they also power other things. But basically, we need 60 miles per hour of wind. Okay, now we need to understand the relationship between speed and angle of attack. So if we fall less than 60 miles per hour, the wings will not produce enough lift in order to sustain that aircraft, all right, generally speaking. And that's pretty much, that is not representative of how the wings will be positioned or your angle of attack will be positioned. So let's say let's give ourselves 3 different situations. Let's say 250 knots, and knots are like miles per hour. guys, for anybody that's just checking in on the video. Let's see the wing at 100 knots, and let's see this wing at 60 knots. All right, and think of knots for all the people that, you know, you're just kind of checking this video out. You know, as like, just think of it as miles per hour. A knot is what we use in airplane and boat terms. Miles per hour or statute miles is what we use in car miles. So at 250 knots, this wing may even be positioned downward a little bit because it's very, very fast. And the air molecules they're flowing so fast over the wing that the wing is generating a lot of lift, and it actually needs to pitch down a little bit in order to maintain flight. At 100 knots, the wing may need to have an angle of attack something like this. And at 60 knots, the angle of attack would be like this. And this is why when airplanes get very, very slow, they're pretty much in a slightly nose-up position. All right, so you can see that this airfoil is pretty much pitched up a little bit. So we can see the different angles of attack as the relative wind approaches the airfoil or the wing. In aerodynamics, we call a wing an airfoil. But airfoil is any device that's used to produce lift. So there's different types of cambers, but I just wanted to kind of generalize what we have going on here. All right. So we talked about the 4 forces of flight. And we talked about drag and how drag is a subcomponent of, well, drag has subcomponents. And we talked about parasite drag. We talked about induced drag. Induced drag is basically caused by the is just the generation of lift. That's how parasite induced drag is caused. And then we have parasite drag, and there's 3 components of parasite drag. What are the 3 components, Kieno? I'll tell you. All right, the 3 subcomponents of drag, because we have lift, we have thrust, we have weight, and we have drag. And I'll put a T, a L, a D for drag, and W for weight. And we have 2 components. I'll put I for induced and P for parasite. Parasite drag can be broken down into some subcomponents. All right. Let me just get my talking points up here, guys. We have skin friction drag. Put her in there. Now, when we rub our hands over our wings when we're pre-flighting, it basically feels like a smooth surface. But if we put this under a microscope, we would actually see ridges that air can be trapped in. So air can get trapped in these ridges. And I'm sorry, I should have brought that up a little bit. So here's our microscopic view. I just looked at the camera and noticed. But if we put this under a microscope, then there are little spots under a microscope or ridges that air can be trapped in. All right, so that is our skin friction drag. All right, let's talk about another component. And these all total parasite drag, these 3 components. All right, so that is the skin friction drag. We also have interference drag. Interference drag is the mixing of airflow between components. So you may have a wing flying through the air, and then you may have an external fuel tank, all right, attached to the wing. And just the fact that these 2 bodies are kind of slicing through the air, we get interference drag. All right, so that's skin friction drag and interference drag. It's interfering if you would. All right, and then lastly, we have a form drag. All right, and it's just putting a form out there like your hand. If you stick your hand out of the window, let me just try to position my hand. So you just position your hand out of the window, you're going to get some drag. And how we reduce that is by streamlining. So instead of placing your hand out of the window like this, you may pivot it like this, and it can slice through the air more easy. So skin friction, parasite, and form drag are the three subcomponents of drag that you should be familiar with before you go to undergraduate pilot training or undergraduate pilot training or API. Now, let's talk about induced drag. Induced drag is just caused by the generation of lift. As the wing flies through the air, and we're just going to say that this is the fuselage, and this is one of the wings extending. All right, we're going to get two different sets of airflow. Let me see if I can't find me another color. All right, so basically, if we look from a side view, we know that air is going to be flowing over the top of the wing, and air is going to be flowing over the bottom of the wing. And so the air over the top of the wing will kind of come in like this towards the fuselage, and airflow on the bottom of the wing will kind of be moving in that direction. All right, now if the wing just kind of stretched on forever and ever and ever and ever, we would not have any problems. But if we look at the fuselage and the wing from, and I'm just going to stick the wing out a little bit, we have a serious air disturbance or a vortex. A vortex. That is singular. Plural is vortices. Vortices. All right. And so what happens? Everything is easy breezy when it flies over the wing, but what happens is the airflow of the bottom moves outward, and the airflow on top of the wing, if you could visualize, kind of moves inward. But when we get out to the outside of the wing, we have a little hurricane, if you would. All right, and these are wingtip vortices. Wingtip vortices are strongest when you're kind of slow on departure. You're slow, you're building up power, you're generating lift, and if you were flying behind a larger aircraft, it could really rock you. It happened to me kind of like I was coming in on runway 27 into Philly one time, and I was flying for the organ donor program. And if we look at how these, we understand how the differences in the upper wing and lower wing airflow patterns happen. But if we look at it from a side view, what happens is our airplane flies through the sky. There's our wing, here's our tail. What happens is these little disturbances kind of fall as the airplane flies through the sky. So if you are an airplane flying behind this plane and you're a much smaller aircraft, all right, then what would happen is you would want to stay either at the flight level of that airplane in front of you or above. But sometimes when air traffic controllers are giving you altitudes and they say descend and maintain 2,000 feet or, I don't know, even lower, 1,500, then sometimes you can possibly be caught in the wake. W-A-K-E. It's kind of like if you saw a big boat, you're in a small boat, and a large boat just kind of cruises by. It cuts through the water. It causes a disturbance. And air and water react the same way, sort of, kind of. And basically what happens is you kind of get caught up in the wake. So this is the same thing. Air and water act the same way. All right. So induced drag produces wingtip vortices, and we need to stay at or above the flight level of the aircraft producing those wingtip vortices. They're very strong when the airplane is on climb out. So just to give us an idea, let's say we have a runway right here, right? This is the runway. And our larger aircraft kind of takes off like that. And we'll give ourselves another situation. Let me get that up a little bit. Another situation where an aircraft is coming in for a landing. All right, and it comes to a full stop. All right, so this aircraft starts here, takes off. This aircraft comes in for a landing, and it touches down and it lands. All right. Well, if we are a smaller aircraft, then what we need to do is, if the air traffic controller clears you for takeoff, he'll say he or she will say November 310 Delta, you're clear for takeoff, runway 27, caution, wake, turbulence. That is the phrase. Caution, wake, turbulence. They will say that over the frequency. So what you would want to do is you would want to take off before the departure point and stay above and upwind. Conversely, if you're landing, you want to stay above the flight path of the aircraft and touch down past the touchdown point of the larger aircraft. Because the whole time that this aircraft is taking off, the wake turbulence is going to be here. And when the aircraft is landing, the wake turbulence is going to be here. And let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. The wake turbulence will rock you a little bit. All right, so you definitely do not want it in this scenario when you're landing. You already have to deal with crosswinds, things of that nature. And then you're coming in to land, and you mess around and you get too low, and then that could be an issue. All right, as far as directional control. And it's not good because in landing you want to land as slow as possible. So if you're slow as possible, you don't have the same amount of airflow for directional controllability, and that could be an issue. Conversely, you're also slow, but you're building airspeed. In the departure phase, you're high power, you're on the climb out, man. You're trying to generate lift, and the last thing you need is something disturbing you. So that is something that we need to be cognizant of when we are taking off or landing behind larger aircraft. Wake turbulence and wingtip vortices. Okay. The next topic that you will need to be familiar with in flight training is something called, or a phenomenon called, ground effect. Ground effect significantly reduces induced drag and increases effective lift. So what does that mean? That means out of our four basic forces of flight, we have lift being generated. We have weight, just caused by a gravitational pull. We have drag, and we have thrust being produced. All right, so the thrust is being produced. Now, in unaccelerated flight, where you're just at a constant airspeed, the lift equals weight and the thrust equals drag. Now, what is ground effect? Ground effect is the interference of the Earth with the airflow patterns about the wing. I forgot my T. So what does that mean? Let's say this airplane is up. It is above one wingspan in length above the ground. We'll have a normal upwash and downwash pattern when this wing cuts through the air. But when we get down here and landing in a landing configuration, what happens is the wing is down here. So there's not a lot of air molecules below the wing like it would be in this situation. Like if this was 500 feet in the air, and this is, I'll just say on the ground. I'll put on ground. All right, so the airflow patterns here, we don't have as much upwash, downwash produced or going on. So as a result, what happens is we lose some of this induced drag. All right. So it will be less induced drag here, more induced drag here. And remember, induced drag is the byproduct of lift. So now we're in a situation where we have the same amount of lift and less drag. And there's a couple things that could happen in this situation. Remember, we need a certain amount of airspeed flowing over and above the wing in order for it to be producing a good amount of lift. All right. So in ground effect, we may become airborne before we're supposed to. All right. And when that happens, the proper procedure is to remain within one wingspan of the airfield, or the runway, I should say, until we get the airspeed to produce the proper amount of lift. Because if we climb out above one wingspan, then this drag comes back with the same amount of lift, and we're at a slower airspeed, and that's not going to be sufficient to keep the plane in the air. All right. So we could have an abrupt settling back down to the runway if we're not careful. Now, pilots are trained, so I mean, all you passengers or people that maybe were looking at this video, oh my God, ground effect, do not freak out. As a flight instructor, on very, very hot, humid days when ground effect is really more likely to occur, we train our students to stay within one wingspan, because this could really be happening on what we would call a short field takeoff, when we have a shorter runway that we need to take off from. So basically what we'll do is we'll break ground and we'll stay within one wingspan. Once we get our airspeed, then we'll climb out. All right, so it's not anything to freak out about. We train and beat this into the students' heads. All right. So we talked about total drag. Total drag is I'm just looking at my talking notes. We're not going to talk about LD max at this point. Thrust required, thrust available. And give me a moment, folks. I'm just covering, just kind of going over my talking points here. And again, while I discuss this, all right, we're going to talk about two types of configurations. What is a configuration? A configuration is basically a setup or situation. The aircraft is configured. All right, so let's take two airplanes. This airplane is taking off. All right, and this is what we would call a clean configuration. We don't see any landing gear extended. There's no flaps extended, and we're full power. Our airplane is clean because the flaps and the gear are up. In a dirty configuration, and if you've ever been flying and you looked out the window, you could see flaps extended, or even leading edge flaps, where we have extensions come off the wing on the leading edge and the trailing edge. And basically what we're doing is we're increasing camber. Camber is just a fancy word for curve. And the more curve that we have, the greater lift we can produce at a slower airspeed. So if the airfoil just looked like this, okay, we would need at least 60 knots or miles per hour. I'll keep this in layman's terms. But with the flaps and the slats extended, we could actually slow down to probably 45 miles per hour. And this is why when you look out the window, you'll see the slots or slats or different panels just kind of sliding down and curving, because we're in a landing configuration. We're preparing to land, and we want to be as slow as possible. And so we have a lot of drag helping us out to get us slow. Whereas in this situation, oh, and also, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, and forgive my little artwork, but the landing gear are also extended. So this is what we would call a dirty configuration or landing configuration, and this is what we would call a clean configuration. So these are just two different types of ways that we set up our airplanes. The clean configuration, basically, in the clean configuration, we don't have a lot of things protruding, causing interference drag, or form drag, as we would call it when we're discussing drag. Basically, the clean configuration, the flaps are up, and the gear is up, and this is the configuration that we will be in a climb out. Whereas in this configuration, we will be we want to be as slow as possible. So if I had the choice of approaching the runway at 60 miles an hour versus 45 miles per hour, I would want to have my airplane approach the runway at 45 miles per hour because it's just a much slower transition. Things happen a little bit slower at 45 miles per hour than they do at 60 miles per hour. So we definitely want to be in a dirty configuration with our slats and flaps extended and our landing gear extended, and extra curvature from the flaps and slats, or leading edge flaps, some people call it, enable us to fly at a slower airspeed. All right. So that is that topic covered. And just some things to think about. All right. All right. Control, balance, overhang. Bup, 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 bup. Okay, let's go to some of our terms and definitions. We talked about aerodynamic force in the beginning of the video. Aerodynamic force is basically the resultant force as a result of lift and drag. Okay, so we have lift acting in an upward direction, and we have drag acting in a rearward direction. And the aerodynamic force is actually going to be the resultant vector, and it is a function of these, the upward and the rearward force, and so it is kind of up and back. When we're in a climb out, that's when we would see that. Alrighty. Some more definitions. I'm not going to cover those. I'll reserve that for my subscribers that are actually in the course. Alright. Alright, now we're going to talk about a couple of, we kind of talked about it before, but we talked about planform. Planform, Planform. Now, the wing planform is basically looking at the aircraft, and let's make this kind of like a straighter wing. And then you may have something, say like you may have a delta wing, which is more like I'm sorry. There we go. So you have a straight wing, or it's pretty much straight. It's tapered in the front. And you have a delta wing. This wing configuration, or this wing planform, is very, very effective at low speeds, whereas this aircraft is very, very effective at high speeds. So this wing planform, it's pretty much straight. If you look at, like, say something like, I don't know, one of the older aircraft, okay, older airplanes, they don't move that fast, and so you pretty much have a straight planform. Whereas the delta wing, this wing is designed for high-speed flight. So if you look at your F-16, your F-15, that type aircraft, and another type, you could just have like on most of your commercial airliners, your wings could just be swept back like this. Okay, and forgive my artwork there, but this is a sweep back. Okay, so we're thinking in terms of the lateral axis. All right. So here's a lateral axis on this airplane. Here's a lateral axis on this airplane, and here's a lateral axis on this airplane. Okay, so you can see the angles formed here and here in reference to the lateral axis. These angles are more pronounced in the swept back with the delta wing configuration. All right. So when we think about lift, all right, let's say that this wing stops producing effective lift at 60 miles per hour, where this wing may stop producing effective lift at 90 miles per hour, and this wing may stop producing effective lift at 150 miles per hour. Now, these planforms, or the way that these wings look from a top view, these are designs that aeronautical engineers, they think about when they're designing airplanes. When they think about the function, what is the function of this aircraft? Okay, is it going to be, something for training? Training is very, very good because you have lower landing speeds. All right. Whereas these two aircraft could never ever get to 60 miles per hour without stalling. So let's say this aircraft stalls at 60 miles per hour, the sweepback stalls at 90 miles per hour, and this wing or this aircraft stops producing effective lift at 150 miles an hour. This aircraft could never get down to 90 miles per hour, and this aircraft could not get down to 60 miles per hour based on the shape of the wing. So aeronautical engineers, they get together. They just don't just get together and be like, okay, I want the wing to look like this. No, when you design the airplane, you have to think about the function of the aircraft. All right, very, very, very important. Very, very important. So before we even think about designing, okay, well, what's the function? What is this aircraft going to do? If it's something like a Cessna 172 or a Piper Malibu, or a Cessna Citation, which is a jet, but it has a straight wing configuration, which means it could land at very, very short runways, where these two aircraft cannot land on very, very short ways. This is kind of like your airliner configuration here. Okay, this aircraft is not going to land on a 1,500-foot runway because it has to come in very, very, very fast in order to produce effective lift. Same with this one. This aircraft is not going to land on a 1,500-foot runway. And where there are, like, runways that say something like, okay, if you live in New Jersey, Princeton Airport, Cupper Airport, or I think they call it Central Jersey Regional Airport now. All right. These airplanes would probably have to land at some places like Newark International Airport, where you have almost 2 miles of runway. All right, because they come in very, very fast and they need a lot of runway to land on. Whereas this aircraft with the straighter wing can land at somewhere like Princeton Airport or Trenton, Mercer County Airport. But you know what? Trenton, Mercer County Airport has a 6,000-foot runway. So it's kind of, that airport is kind of good for medium size because you got medium size runways that run about 6,000 feet. And so you can use Highlift devices, and we're going to talk about that next, Highlift devices. All right. So the planform, or the way that the wing is viewed from the top, is really, really taken into consideration when we're talking about the function of an aircraft. Now, this leads us into, or segues into, high lift devices. As I told you before, if we look at this airfoil from a side view, all right, this is our airfoil, and we're going to say this is our airfoil, another airfoil. All right, I know my work is not that great, but basically we're going to have the relative wind approaching the wing. All right, and this wing is actually in a clean configuration. But like I said, if you're sitting by the wing and you're watching it come in for a landing, what you're probably going to see are some leading edge slats, and you're going to see some flaps extending and hanging downward. Now, if you look at this wing and this wing, all right, when the flaps and slats are retracted, they come back into the main body of the airfoil. Whereas in this situation, they extend outside. So what we have is more camber or curvature. Now, there's a couple things. If we have a slotted airfoil, then we have more airflow paths being created. And it's actually speeding up the airflow. And we're generating more lift in this situation. All right. Whereas in this clean configuration, we don't have as much camber. And in a sense, we're producing less lift if we get at slower air speeds. So this airfoil at a low speed compared to this airfoil at a low speed is producing more lift. And actually, this airfoil, without the flaps and slats retracted, would have to have a higher, would have to be pitched slightly more nose up in order to generate the same amount of lift. Now, when we're landing, can we have our nose pointed all the way up in the air? No. So what happens is we extend our slats and our flaps in order so the pilots can kind of see the runway and produce a similar amount of lift at a slower airspeed. Okay, so these are Highlift Devices, slats and flaps, and they extend. And if you're sitting by the wing on a, you're going on a commercial trip, you're flying on a commercial flight, you sit by the wings, you will see the slats and flaps extend. Sometimes on shorter runways, they will use slats and flaps because we generate more lift at a slower airspeed, and we are able to generate the lift in order to aerodynamically take the weight of the aircraft off the wheels or landing gear and transfer them to the wings in order for the aircraft to maneuver out of those situations. Because you could have obstacles. What I mean by obstacles? Sometimes you have some airports that are in some very busy areas. So in that case, you would have your runway here, and you may have some tall buildings going on here. All right, so you could have trees. You could even have, like out in Salt Lake City, you have mountains. All right, you have mountains. So we would use our flaps and slats in order to get us above all that madness. All right. Conversely, if we have obstacles at the approach end of the runway, we can come in at a steeper glide path without increasing our airspeed. So if we didn't have slats and flaps, we would need more of a takeoff and departure or approach and departure path like this. But when we extend our flaps and slats, our slats down and our flaps down, we have more curvature. All right, this is more curved. We have a slight curvature on the top in this case, but we have more curvature and we're also extending our angle of attack as well. All right, let's have our relative wind there. All right, and so without slats and flaps, our approach path would have to be like this, and we can't do that because we have buildings there. Or our departure path would be like this. We can't do this because we have mountains on this side. So when we extend our flaps and our slats, then what happens is we can increase our angle of descent without increasing airspeed, because in this case, without slats and flaps, we would have to come in at a higher airspeed. When we put the drag in, we get ourselves slower, we generate more lift, but we also generate more drag. And so our wing is more curved. All right. And so this helps us generate a higher amount of lift at a slower airspeed. So that's what slats and flaps are for. Okay. We have different types of flaps. I'm not going to go into that at this point. You would have to be actually attending the course or the Google Hangout in order for that. So basically, I'm going to close right there. Okay, that is our third installment of the aerodynamics section. Next week is going to be the engine and propulsion systems or navigation. I'm not sure which one I'm going to do yet. And hopefully, this is my first time doing a Facebook Live. I have tons of videos. You can put Kieno and Thomas will actually automatically pop up in the search box. Our website is stemwithkieno.com. All right. STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math. And on the landing page, I'll put YT for YouTube. You can click on the YouTube icon on our landing page, and basically it will take you to YouTube and my list of videos. All right, so I thank you guys for taking time out to watch this video now and in the future. And we do a free live stream every Friday night, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. And basically you can go to the website, you can click the YouTube icon, it will take you directly to my videos and the live stream and stuff like that. So anybody that is aspiring to be a military aviator, United States Navy, United States Marine Corps, United States Coast Guard, United States Air Force, or United States Army, rotary wing or fixed wing. I encourage you to come check out my videos and stuff like that. And we also do test preparation for those videos. We have a 100% pass rate. Okay, because you don't want just a regular score when you put your packet together. You want an outstanding score to help you stand out above the rest. Okay, so put my head back in the camera. I thank you guys for watching. Remember, stemwithkieno.com. Remember to live stream every Friday night, like 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. And I'd like to thank you guys for watching. Have a great evening. I'll see you next week with engine propulsion systems. Have a good night. Bye-bye. Okay.